I'm really excited to be here with all of you and to share some new ideas. I like to think of these as open loops that between TF and TF that have been going on since we first met around 8 years ago. I was a new postdoc at the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science, and I came here on a small grant to visit for a few weeks, and that resulted in a paper that has done relatively well, but there were some open loops that are left unclosed, and what I'm going to try to do today is maybe iterate them a little bit further and see where we go from there. So I'm going to start talking about the other, social interaction, then I'll switch to schizophrenia, I'll say a little bit about time, and then I'll try to open up some new loops for further iterations. So the other. Good that Ezekiel presented before me, so now you'll already be familiar with the inactive approach to social interaction. To give you just a quick overview, this was one of Reda's papers before he died, and he kind of sketched what he thought was the basic trajectory of cognitive science in terms of looking at social cognition. On the far left, you see the other as problem in the 1960s when computationalism started cognitive science. And on the far right, he said other as interbeing. And interestingly, he puts the date 2007, which is, of course, the date of Hanne de Jager's and Ezekiel's paper on participatory sense-making. So it looks like you were just on time. So the other as problem to be solved is this idea that we are fundamentally separated from others, and that's why we have to use all these cognitive inferential machinery to figure each other out. And this notion of interbeing has been addressed in different ways. One is by Froese and de Jager, who talk about mutual incorporation, inspired by Merleau-Ponty, another phenomenologist. And the paper that we wrote together also builds on this idea. And we talked about the extended body. And what we did in that paper was look at some phenomenologists talking about mutual incorporation and how we affect each other, and build some dynamical formalizations out of those insight. And one recent paper by Froese, he talks about shared meaning constitution and the spiral of participatory sense-making. And that's really the kind of idea that we try to formalize a little bit better by taking a dynamical systems approach. And I'm not going to go to too much detail of that, just to give you kind of, a hint of what the kind of thing we were looking at. Here's Merleau-Ponty talking about how perceiving others reorganizes our motor system, how interacting with others creates a mixture of oneself and the other. And what we showed in a very minimal agent-based model is that indeed, during interactions between the agents, they can go to regions of their state space that would normally be inaccessible to them. And it actually makes them more complex in their behavior. So this was the paper we wrote together 6 years ago now. So since then, I've continued this work a little bit in terms of the agent-based modeling. A subsequent paper that came out in 2013 responded to some criticisms that came from our traditional cognitive science that actually maybe all what we're showing is that the complexity that is generated during social interaction is just a causal effect, not a constitutive effect. So I don't know if you're familiar with this causation constitution and fallacy debate that was very big in cognitive science for a while. But what we did here was show that if you reduce the system so far that this increase in complexity will be in principle impossible for the agent, it still happens in social interaction. So in that case, it has to be a constitutive role for the interaction in order to explain what's going on at the level of the agents. So I'm not going to give you the mathematical arguments for this, but just the take-home message from this work on the dynamical systems approach and agent-based modeling is that I think the default picture that we should adopt is that in social interaction, our mind is interactively extended. Okay, so, or to put it a little bit more formally, nonlinear coupled agents form an extended dynamical system with novel properties. And this picture is a bit misleading because it just looks at the two brains being coupled, but actually the way to think about this more appropriately would be to say that social interaction is an emergent property of a brain, body, environment, body, brain system as a whole. And that, I think, is actually the starting point for when we think about what social interaction is. Now, this comes out of the work that I did in dynamical systems theory. So you might say, well, this is all artificial, this is just modeling, we don't know whether this is true for people. So what we did was apply a similar kind of minimal approach to interactions between actual people. So we studied real-time social interaction, real-time embodied interaction between people that are interacting in a very simple virtual environment, so we could record all the dynamics of their movements. And they engage in these kind of turn-taking patterns and so on. But what we could show in this case, because we're dealing with people, is that when we interview them about their experience during this interaction, we could show that at the moments when both of them recognize each other, there's a qualitative change in their experience, that the presence of the other becomes much more clear to them. And we can actually quantify this effect. So I wonder perhaps whether this could be seen as experimental evidence for the fact that we can have something like a we perspective, a second-person perspective, a collective intentionality. I think that in phenomenology that's already widely accepted, but this might be the first experimental evidence for this, where we both have the dynamics and we have a record of the experience, and we can show that there are qualitative effects of engaging with other people. So all of that work is summarized in a chapter in this forthcoming book on 4E cognition. And in that paper, I conclude that a reciprocal interaction with other people plays a constitutive role in implicitly and explicitly shaping our lives and minds. We generally have relationships with others. We are not independent, but interdependent. And these insights return cognitive science closer to actual human experience. So I think this classical idea that, of Searle and others, that maybe everybody of you is just a hallucination in my mind and I cannot really be sure about that and so on. We can just reject that and move on and say, no, other people really do matter for our lives and for our experience. So I think that's a very liberating view, that actually by just going back to our experience and how people appear to us, we can do good science with that, both formally and experimentally. So that chapter summarizes over a decade of research, so the rest of this talk, I'm going to switch a little bit to some new ideas. So, schizophrenia. Actually, the work I was doing with Thomas when we were here, it was supposed to be a prelude to thinking about schizophrenia. We never got to thinking about schizophrenia, so I'm going to try to think a bit about it here. So what we showed was that this traditional conception of the isolated person trying to figure out the other person needs to be replaced by this more dynamically integrated perspective. And interestingly, with Giovanni Sangellini and Bertelli, when we looked at the phenomenology of schizophrenics, to some extent, they actually fit this standard picture better. They can't understand others, they can't relate to them, they look opaque, they don't look alive. So weirdly enough, the pathological experience seems to be quite well matching to the standard view of cognitive science. But what we didn't think about in that paper is, what is the meaning of the new view, right? If the default picture that we should adopt now is this extended, integrated view of human sociality, how does that make us think differently about schizophrenia? I think it allows us to respond to one of the challenges that a phenomenological approach to schizophrenia has raised. Here's a paper that tries to revitalize a little bit Rich Year's phenomenology. And they talk about affectivity as being a core component here. They define affectivity in the sense that it sets the pace for a relationship with the world by determining it in its very familiarity, strangeness, harmony, and disharmony. And they give examples of how we affect each other in this way. So if you're with a depressed person, you're more likely to feel depressed yourself. If you're a euphoric person, you might get affected by that and also feel more euphoric yourself. But they say, how is it possible that affectivity coming from the depth of the experiential field may nonetheless arise in the intersubjective encounter and be felt through my own body and then resonate and attune in the other's intimacy? So I think at least this challenge becomes easier to solve now. Okay? it's harder to make sense of this if you are accepting this methodological individualist picture. But if our default situation is of being a bigger dynamically integrated system, well, then it's not so surprising anymore that we affect each other in these fundamental ways. But then they say, moreover, why does this phenomenon not lead to a confusion between the two bodies? And that's an interesting question. I think this is actually sharpening our minds now that we have a new problem to explain. It's not the problem anymore of classical cognitive science to say, how do we get to know the other person? Now the problem is the inverse one. How do we not confuse ourselves with the other person? Okay? If this is the correct story of being completely interconnected, of actually forming one big, brain, body, environment, body, brain system as a whole, well, then how do we come to experience ourselves as separate individuals? I think that's now the interesting question to ask. Okay, and for Richier, these issues constitute a core problem of schizophrenia. And what I find interesting as well is that actually something that we didn't talk about in our paper in schizophrenia is that there is actually in schizophrenia also this experience of confusion of bodies. It's not just complete isolation and detachment. You can also have the opposite extreme. Okay, so here's Parnas reporting on one of his patients. He says, a young man was frequently confused in a conversation, being unable to distinguish between himself and his interlocutor. He tended to lose the sense of whose thoughts originated in whom, and felt as if the interlocutor somehow invaded him. An experience that shattered his identity and was intensely anxiety-provoking. Okay, so to my mind, this is participant sense-making gone wrong, right? So others are participating in him, and he's participating in others, but he's feeling it as intensely threatening, as anxiety-evoking, right? And this is just one example. So there are many symptoms that you can find, like invasion of self, self-influence of other, unusual influences of the other over the self, merging of self and other, confusion of thought, ownership, and agency, right? But if we buy into, for example, Thomas's notion of the spiral of participatory sense-making, right? At the top he had the notion of shared meaning. Well, that's precisely a confusion of thought ownership, right? That's saying that meaning doesn't belong just to me, doesn't belong just to you. It's something that we co-created. Okay, there is no sense of saying it's just something that belongs to me. So why is it that in schizophrenia, that's a problem? Right? And for us, it's not a problem. So this is an interesting shift, I think, that we can stop thinking about these perhaps as, positive symptoms or hallucinations. That only makes sense if you think that our default condition is one of isolation. But if our default condition is one of dynamical mixture, then these are not hallucinations. Perhaps we get closer to this when we talk about unusual attention to experiences we all have, maybe brought about by hyper-reflexivity, some kind of sensitivity or underlying anxiety that makes these experiences that we normally all share and we don't pay attention to much more salient and threatening somehow. So in a recent paper, Thomas also talks about this phenomenon. He says, interaction with others implies a continuous oscillation between the central embodied perspective and the decentered perspective from which I'm aware of the other as being aware of me, being aware of him. It is this dialectical tension of the eccentric position that the schizophrenic patient cannot maintain anymore. Their perspectives of self and other are confused instead of being integrated from a self-other meta perspective, resulting in a sense of being invaded and overpowered by the other. I'm not sure what Thomas means by self-other meta perspective. Sounds to me almost like he's going a level up in the hierarchy, but maybe the problem is actually at a level below, as we will see. And I think that once we think about this problem of self and other, we find it all over the place. It's not just related with other people, but with alterity in general. And so in the work that Thomas and Sanneke have done, they have one patient reporting about his body in two completely opposite ways. The patient says, everything I do it with logic and reconsideration. Almost nothing works naturally of its own accord. However, I can also do things without even noticing. I get up, I brush my teeth, I get back, and I cannot even remember what I have done in between. That also happens. It's a combination of both. Either complete automatism or complete control. So the way I would take this is that there seems to be an affective instability leading to confusion of self and other, but this time in the context of the alterity of the body. So either I'm completely disaffected from my body, or I'm so effectively identifying with my body that my self disappears for a while. Okay, but this in between, this ambiguity between self and other, is something that they cannot maintain. So my proposal is that maybe we can generalize this, because phenomenologically speaking, we can't really separate self, others, and world. They form a unity, right, for subjectivity. So this idea of an extreme switch between hypo and hyper affective familiarity, I think it actually gives us another way of thinking about how to categorize symptoms. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but here's the ease structured interview. In terms of self, if you think about hypo-familiarity, we can think about loss of thought ipsity. So thoughts will seem strange to you if you're not effectively identifying them. Right? You will have an eye split. You will be depersonalized. But we also have the other side of the spectrum, hyper-familiarity. Identity confusion, transitivism, confusion with the other, the things that I already mentioned. Maybe even going to solipsistic-like experiences, right? Myself is everything else. And then recently we have the extension of this interview to the world. And as part of the world, there's the other. And again, we can have this distinction between hypo-familiarity and hyper-familiarity. Okay, so in the case of the reduced familiarity, we have the classic symptoms of dissociality where we don't understand the other, we don't have any attunement, right? There's depersonalization of others, difficulty of understanding emotional expressions, and so forth. But again, we also have the other extreme. We have disturbance of the self-other demarcation, difficulties with the gaze, so the gaze invades you, or you invade the other person. Complete strangers may seem like you've known them already. And the same applies to the world. Here, there are some big categories, right? Derealization of the world. The world seems unfamiliar to you. Something completely external, other to you. Or you just lose the boundaries. You merge with the world. You merge into objects. You're not sure where your hand ends and the object you're holding begins. Is this microphone part of me or is it part of the world? That kind of thing. And I think it applies to time too. So now we're moving to a really fundamental level. Okay? Feeling limited or isolated within the present moment. Or time becomes static or infinite. So what I'm going to do now is try to go to this temporal level. Because to some extent, this diagram, right? If we can find this hyper-familiarity applying to self, world, and other, maybe we should look for a common source at its root, at the constitution of the minimal self in intrinsic temporality. So, another open loop with Thomas. I remember talking with him in his office, and we had a big paper, and we started scribbling all kinds of notes about time and schizophrenia. And so here the guiding thought is that what we showed in terms of the extended body, that we can have a dynamical integration. And this dynamical integration can be experienced either in the schizophrenia as an over-identification, so you're losing your sense of self, or if you lack this familiarity, you're just going to feel isolated. Well, what if we apply it to the dynamic of integration of time consciousness? Okay, so Varela has done a lot of work of that. We can apply the dynamical systems approach in a similar way to we did between two people. We can look at how they couple together, how they synchronize together, and so on, and form a bigger system. It's not so important, the details of this. And what he was trying to explain was the structure of time consciousness. So this is, on the one hand, from the embodied mind. So you have a sequence of now moments going along. And then we have Husserl's diagram of trying to explain how it's possible that we experience this flow of now moments in a continuous way. So if 6 is our current moment, 7 hasn't happened yet. In his diagram, that's C. And for C, B and A are past moments. And if you move back in the past, 5 would be B. Well, in that case, A would be the past moment. That's one way of picturing it. The preferred way for me is to picture this in a nested way. So I've created this diagram. So you have the primal impression, you have protension, which opens you a little bit for the possibilities of what's going to come next. And on the other side, you have retention, which was another primal impression, but of the past, of what has been. And in that primal impression, of course, there was a protentive moment and there was a retentive moment. And then you can go even further. You can look into that retentive moment, and that itself will have a protentive and a retentive moment, and so forth. And it's this nested structure which guarantees, on a structural level, the continuity of your stream of consciousness. The fact that it's one flow of experiences. So in this analysis of this, Varela already related this temporality with affect. He says, Husserl remarks that during a melody, the sounds affect me differently as it creates its retentional threads and attentional tendency, a disposition which is marked by gradual intensities. And then he quotes Nathalie Dupras, who says, affect is thus this non-form, which makes a constitution of the self by itself, that affects it in the strict sense of structure, that of constitutive temporality. Affect is there before being there for me in full consciousness. I'm affected before knowing that I'm affected. It is in that sense that affect can be said to be primordial. And in the same paper, this is this famous neurophenomenology paper, there's a kind of footnote paragraph by Varela where he says, with Levinas, a further sphere of affection, heteroaffection, is brought to the fore. The other, alterity, is the primary clue for time's constitution. Alterity as inseparable from the sphere of an ego self. Okay, this should all ring our alarm bells. Well, the other, right? We've been talking about the other in the first part of this talk. It is in this move the very distinction between auto and hetero ceases to be relevant, since in all cases it is all brought down to the same manifestation. It is a question of something other, the experience of an alterity, a difference in the identity of the present, whether by the inevitable slippages to retention or by the anticipations and protension. Okay, so your primal impression, right, is not what you're going to be in the future, and is not identical to what just happened in the past. And that's necessary, right? That's how time flows. If you get rid of that difference, there will be no time flow. So there is an irreducible alterity at the core of time consciousness. Now, Varela doesn't go further into this, but what's interesting here is that he's talking about it in terms of structure, right? So this is in the strict sense of structure. And I was happy to see when I was researching that Thomas actually has iterated this open loop a little bit further, and we've actually more or less converged, I think, on what the key problem here is. He says, the intentional microstructure of time consciousness as analyzed by Husserl still does not seem to suffice for the self-familiarity. The basic and unquestionable evidence of being and remaining oneself is mediated both by the self-referentiality of the stream of consciousness and by its continuous self-affection based on the lived body. The self-continuity that we rely upon in our everyday life cannot be of a merely cognitive kind, but implies an affective self-familiarity. No amount of reflection and recollection can compensate for a lack of basic self-familiarity. So I think that is really the key. It's this sense of affective self-familiarity which is at stake here. That's what allows you to bridge the alterity inherent in temporality. Okay, so in the social domain, we will call this empathy. And at the time I was thinking, can we have a notion of self-empathy somehow? Okay, so Dan has advised me not to use that word, so maybe I should use affective self-familiarity instead. It's a bit of a mouthful, but if it makes the phenomenologist happy, then maybe we should go that way. So if this is true, I think what it points to is that, to some extent, schizophrenia is a disorder of self-affection. And of course, I'm not the first to say this. Here's Sass. He says, alterations of cognitive, perceptual, and kinesthetic proprioceptive dimensions can themselves be seen as manifestations of a more central disturbance of ipseity, that is, of the fundamental sense of existing as a vital and directed subject of awareness that is at one with itself at any given moment. Note how you can be at one in two different ways, right? You can be structurally at one, or affectively at one. And he says, this in turn involves, among other things, a diminishment of basic self-affection, of the passively or automatically experienced and affect-related sense of existing as a living and unified subject of awareness. And he quotes Michel Henry here. And he has a footnote here to explain what is self-affection. And I find this very interesting. He says, to be affected means to be touched, moved, motivated. Self-affection refers to being affected by the self or self-feeling of the self. So actually, I think already there, although this is just a footnote, we can see that there's a sense of distinguishing between the structural, self-referential, self-perturbation aspect of self-affection and the felt, self-feeling aspect of self-affection. And in a paper by Sean and Francisco Varela, they also try to talk about the relationship between intrinsic temporality and schizophrenia, and I think they come to some similar conclusion. They say, clearly a certain affective disconcertion is an integral part of the phenomenological picture associated with these impairments of self-temporalization. That is, the schizophrenic phenomenology is not simply a structural or logic problem that can be captured in terms of a deficiency in information processing. If the subject's experiences can be characterized in some cases as involving a logical asynchronicity or confusion of thought, these cognitive problems are importantly not affectively neutral, even if the content of thought is not emotionally charged, but are characterized by a specific affective disposition, which in some cases involve a lack of or alienation from affect. So for me, that would be the hypo-familiarity spectrum. And I wonder whether there's a relationship with Matthew's Radcliffe's idea that anxiety can sometimes lead to the feeling of thought insertion or hearing voices. In this case, it would be the lack of affective identification which would be producing this kind of confusion. So going back to Husserl's idea of intrinsic temporality, this lack of affect, I think we can diagrammatically show like this. The structure is the same as I showed you before, but now imagine that all the little differences between who you were just now and who you're going to become next are for you affectively super salient and threatening. Okay, so the differences are super exaggerated, although maybe structurally they're not as different as normally, but they appear to you as very different. In that case, I think what we might have is what Giovanni has recently found in a study of the phenomenology of time consciousness and schizophrenia, and what they call itemization of temporality. Now there's no more affective link between the different moments that are passing, and each of them feels very different from what has become before or what will come next. So each now is an item, a separate item. In that case, I might suggest maybe we could also find a correlation with acceleration. Maybe reports of acceleration would be here also. Because the difference between this moment and the next appears to you so big that you might have the sense that although time's passing normally, you're being overwhelmed by new experiences because they're always so different. So this would be the hypo-familiarity case. And now let's try to go to the other extreme. What happens if you have a hyper-self-familiarity? Again, let's keep the structure the same, but let's just say that effectively you don't see any difference. Well, in that case, temporality to some extent should appear to you as ceasing to exist. You need to have a difference between the primal impression and what's going to come next or what happened in the past in order to have a sense of time flowing. Right? So either, time seems to be infinite, you're caught in an internal now, or at least, if it's not so extreme, you should experience a deceleration. The differences between now and what's going to come next appear to you smaller. Okay, so that's, to some extent, what I want to say about schizophrenia and temporality. And now I just want to kind of open up some new loops that, I'd like to discuss with all of you during this conference. So the first one is, what do you think about this idea about being clear about the difference between the structural aspects and the qualitative, affective aspects? Right? So I think that maybe a lot of emphasis in the literature has been put on understanding schizophrenia as a disorder of ipsity at the structural level. I'm not sure if this is true or not. Maybe you can correct me. But I think that it might be worthwhile to kind of like make it more explicit that perhaps some of these symptoms are better understood as disorders of self-familiarity rather than as self-structure. Okay? The structural self-constitution, for me, is best described at its most fundamental level as the tripartite structure of time consciousness leading to a dynamically integrated consciousness. Okay, so this is the unity of a stream of consciousness. Affective self-constitution, on the other hand, is best described at its most fundamental level as the self-familiarity between the tripartite structures of time consciousness leading to an affectively unified stream of consciousness. And the two things come apart in schizophrenia, right? So if I were to sit in my room at night and I have suddenly a eureka moment, an idea pops into my head that I totally wasn't expecting, that is totally disintegrated from my context, right? But it's like, yeah, now I understand it. I don't feel threatened by that, right? Even though it comes out of nowhere. I don't think of that as a thought being inserted into my head. The schizophrenic patients might have a kind of threatening experience when that happens. But note that he's still having the experience. So in that sense, the structural flow is still intact. Okay? Because if that thought was not structurally integrated, he couldn't have that thought. It wouldn't be appearing to him from his first-person perspective. But effectively, it might seem very alien to him that this is happening. Okay? So that's why this distinction is so important. And here I talk about self-constitution. But the other point I want to make is that I think we should broaden this, and this is what has been happening with this interview as well, to talk about the self, world, and other in an integrated way. And we had a nice lecture by Laney talking about the different levels of constitution, and that helped me a lot to think about this. So she distinguished between intersubjective community, interpersonal intersubjectivity, active constitution, passive synthesis, and the primordial epileptic flow. And in this talk, I've only talked about two of these levels. So that was the interpersonal one and the temporal one. But I wonder whether we can actually talk about this disorder of self-familiarity of all of these levels. Right? So we have the affective self-familiarity at the level of temporal constitution. But maybe, Professor Sass was talking about the self-feeling of the self, and he was talking about that. He was talking about the passive level of passive synthesis. Yesterday in Sean's lecture, we heard about Maes' idea of affective framing. I think that might be situated at the level of active constitution. The goals I have right now, what's my intention to do next. I've quoted Richier on the affective contagion that we have in interpersonal interactions. And also we had Dan talk about the inner bond that connects us in communities. So perhaps in schizophrenia, we should look at these levels in terms of extreme versions of either hypo or hyper identification in an effective way. And so I'm going to close now with the final diagram that for me helps to think about this a lot. And is to say that normally we have no problem dealing with the ambiguity between self and other. And what we do actually is we regulate that ambiguity depending on the context, so that if you're with your loved ones, you're going to be a bit more hyper affective with them. And if you're with someone that threatens you, you're going to distance yourself emotionally, or with strangers, let's say. And that's fine. That's how we do it. So we can actually regulate a little bit our affective integration with others and with the world and with our bodies. In schizophrenia, that ambiguity, that in-between, becomes too unstable, or they can't regulate it properly anymore. And then they have two options. Either they fall into the extreme of hyper-familiarity, which is an over-identification with the self, world, and others, or they fall into the other extreme, which is the hypo-familiarity, which is depersonalization, derealization, right? Disembodiment. And now we can actually categorize the symptoms in these two ways. And when we talk about the frequency of the symptoms, when Giovanni and I were talking about this, it seems like the hypo are the more common ones than the hyper. That's just my impression from looking at the literature. I don't know if there's statistics on this. So we can ask this question too. Why is it that once the middle breaks down, the hypo becomes the more probable outcome than the hyper. And I think it has to do with that if you have problems with yourself and you invest reflective resources, then you're more likely to end on the hypo. Because what the hyper basically means is that you're going to lose yourself. Right? And this integration of self, to some extent, will relay some anxiety, fears about death, about disappearing. And that goes back to our most basic emotional level. So do you want to avoid that? For sure. You can't be in the middle, but you don't want to die either, right? As a person. So what you have to do is go to the other extreme and be hypo-familiar with everything. Anyway, that's just conjecture, but I think it helps a lot to think about schizophrenia in this way because it unifies the diversity of its symptoms in quite a clear way and lets us ask new questions that I don't think have been asked in this way before. And so I thank Thomas for opening these loops in the first place by having me here in Heidelberg and allowing us to iterate them a bit more today. Thank you.